€486 million. That's how much EU regulators collected in fines from crypto firms in 2025 alone, and they're just getting started. More than 50 crypto firms had their licenses revoked by February 2025. ESMA, Europe's top securities watchdog, is enforcing a law called MiCA, and it's changing everything about how money moves through crypto. But here's what most people are missing. This isn't just a compliance story, it's a financial crime story about who gets to move money in Europe and who gets shut down for good. If you work in financial crime compliance, anti-money laundering, or crypto, MiCA directly affects the systems you run, the clients you onboard, and the risks you carry, and the July 2026 hard deadline means the window to get this right is closing fast. What you're watching right now is the introduction to something we've spent months building, a full deep dive series, 8 episodes grounded in real regulatory text, real enforcement actions, and real cases designed for professionals who need to actually understand MiCA. There are hundreds of quick explainer videos on MiCA, 5-minute summaries, slide decks, LinkedIn posts. None of them tell you what the regulation actually requires when a suspicious transaction hits your monitoring system at 2 a.m. This series is built for you if you're an MLRO, a compliance officer, a financial crime analyst, a supervisor, or a legal counsel trying to map MiCA onto real-world control frameworks. If you already know what FATF is, what a VASP means, and what the travel rule does, this is where you go next. And here's a question I want you to hold as you watch this teaser. Does your current transaction monitoring system meet MiCA's travel rule requirements right now? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where the industry stands. Let me walk you through what this series covers and why we built it the way we did. MiCA, Regulation EU 2023/1114, entered into force in June 2023. Stablecoin rules hit on 30 June 2024. The main CASP authorization regime launched 30 December 2024. July 1, 2026 is the hard stop. Before MiCA, crypto asset service providers across the EU operated under 27 different national regimes. Some stringent, some barely there. Cross-border arbitrage was rampant. Firms deliberately choosing jurisdictions with weak oversight. MiCA ends that game permanently. FATF introduced the VASP concept. The EU's AMLD5 and AMLD6 put crypto firms on the AML map, but both had gaps, especially on cross-border operations and uniform conduct standards. MiCA closes those gaps by creating the CASP, the Crypto Asset Service Provider. And being a CASP means meeting a full prudential and conduct regime, not just ticking an AML registration box. Here's the architecture that makes this series different from every other MiCA explainer. We don't just cover MiCA in isolation, we cover the 3-law system that actually governs crypto in the EU. MiCA itself, the Anti-Money Laundering Regulation, the AMLR, and the Transfer of Funds Regulation, the TFR. Together, these 3 instruments operationalize FATF's entire VASP regime inside the EU. Take the travel rule. Pre-MiCA, crypto transfers could move across borders with almost no originator or beneficiary data attached. Chain hopping, moving assets through multiple blockchains to obscure the trail, was a staple technique in money laundering typologies. From 30 December 2024, the TFR changed that. Every crypto transfer must now carry sender and recipient data, mirroring what traditional wire transfers have required for decades. Episode 1 of the series covers the big picture. Why AMLD5 and AMLD6 were not enough. How MiCA, AMLR, and TFR interlock. And we use a real case type, the cross-border regulatory arbitrage that let darknet-linked exchanges operate in the EU for years, to show exactly what the new framework is designed to stop. Episode 2 goes into what we call the scope and perimeter fights. MiCA deliberately excludes security tokens, those fall under MiFID II. But drawing that line in practice is harder than it sounds. We walk through a hypothetical where an exchange misclassifies a token as a utility token under MiCA, when it actually meets the legal definition of a MiFID financial instrument. That misclassification triggers a completely different regulatory obligation and potentially a criminal liability. Episode 3 is where we simulate the CASP authorization process in full. We take a legacy crypto exchange, one that was operating under an AMLD5 registration, and walk through what happens when it applies for a MiCA license, the NCA questions, the weak KYC documentation, the missing independent compliance function, and we show you exactly what leads to a conditional approval or an outright refusal. Episode 4 covers governance and internal controls, and here's where it gets uncomfortable for a lot of firms. MiCA Article 62 requires an independent compliance function. Not a shared function, not a part-time role, an independent, resourced compliance operation with direct reporting lines to the board. We look at what poor 3 lines of defense looks like under MiCA, and how under the new regime, a governance failure isn't just a finding in an on-site report. It's grounds for license withdrawal. Episode 5 covers the most technically complex area, high-risk products, privacy-enhancing tokens, mixers, tumblers, DeFi interfaces, the EBA's MLTF risk factor guidelines, now extended to CASPs from 30 December 2024, specify exactly which product features trigger enhanced due diligence. We walk through what a CASP must document before delisting a privacy coin, and what happens when an NCA finds a CASP that admitted one without that documentation. Episode 6 is the one most compliance teams have been waiting for. We take an actual money laundering typology, a cluster of small deposits, chain hopping across 3 blockchains, routing into a mixer, and we walk through in real time what a MiCA-authorized CASP must log, monitor, flag, and report under the combined AMLR and TFR framework, including the specific on-chain data points that the EBA's updated guidelines say you must collect. Episode 7 covers asset reference tokens and e-money tokens, what MiCA calls ARTs and EMTs, stablecoins. We look at the reserve requirements, the redemption obligations, and the scenario where an unlicensed EU-facing global stablecoin collapses, tracing the fraud and ML pathways it opens. And we contrast that with what a properly authorized ART looks like under MiCA's Titles 3 and IV. And Episode 8 brings it all together with enforcement. We look at the NCA powers under MiCA, activity bans, asset freezes, public statements, license withdrawals. We look at how ISMA's interim MiCA register is being used as both a transparency tool and an enforcement trigger. And we examine the pre-MiCA crypto AML cases from BaFin, AMF, CISEC, DNB that foreshadow exactly how the new regime will bite. One case worth knowing now. A prominent European crypto exchange, considered reputable, well-established, faced a €12 million penalty and temporary service suspension for a single compliance oversight under MiCA's framework. Not fraud, not deliberate evasion, an operational gap that was visible in the control environment. Under MiCA, a single compliance oversight costs more than most startups raise in Series A. July 1, 2026. That is the hard stop. ESMA has confirmed no further grace periods. CASPs operating without MiCA authorization after that date must implement orderly wind-down plans. ISMA has also warned that last-minute applications will face heightened regulatory scrutiny. The window to get this right is genuinely closing. The supervisory framework is multi-layered. EBA issues AML guidance for CASPs and extended its MLTF risk factor guidelines to the sector from 30 December 2024. ESMA publishes the RTS and ITS packages and the supervisory briefing that tells NCAs what to look for in a CASP authorization file. And national authorities, BaFin in Germany, the AMF in France, CISEC in Cyprus, the DNB in the Netherlands, are each implementing their own enforcement programs aligned to the MiCA framework. Let me be direct about what this series is not. It is not a general introduction to crypto. It is not a beginner's guide to blockchain. And it is not a tick-the-box summary designed to help firms claim they've done their MiCA training. Every episode is grounded in the actual regulatory text, specific articles, specific RTS requirements, specific EBA guideline paragraphs. If you need proof of concept for a learning program, this is it. Here's what makes each episode genuinely useful for practitioners. We don't just explain the law. For every regulatory requirement, we build what we call a control library, a concrete set of policies, system configurations, KPIs, alert rules, and escalation workflows that translate that requirement into something your compliance team can actually implement. Think of it as the gap between reading the regulation and being audit-ready. All the source documents we reference throughout this series, the MiCA consolidated text, the AMLR, the TFR, the EBA guidelines, the ISMA RTS packages, the supervisory briefing are organized and linked on DaVinciDiligence.com. If you want to follow along with the primary text as you watch, that's your reference hub. And the full series is also available on our Spotify podcast, DaVinci Diligence, for when you need to take this investigation on the road. At the end of every episode, we close with a practitioner reflection question. Not a quiz, not a tick box, a genuine professional scenario. What would you do as the MLRO here? How would you advise the board? What would the supervisor find if they walked in tomorrow? These questions are what turns regulatory knowledge into professional judgment. One more thing I genuinely want from you. Every episode opens a dialogue. If you're already working with MiCA-affected clients, or if you're inside a CASP going through authorization right now, what's the single biggest challenge you haven't seen covered anywhere? Drop it in the comments. The best questions from this community directly shape what we build next. Here's the number that captures the scale of what's happening. By the end of 2025, operating outside MiCA in the EU equated to being shut out of a projected €1.8 trillion market opportunity. That's not a compliance problem, that's a business survival problem. The firms that treated MiCA as a box-ticking exercise are exactly the ones appearing on ESMA's wind-down list. And here's what the regulatory arbitrage players missed. MiCA's CASP license comes with full EU passporting rights. One authorization, valid across all 27 member states. For the firms that built their compliance frameworks properly, that built independent compliance functions, robust transaction monitoring, travel rule-ready systems, MiCA isn't a burden. It's a competitive moat. The full course we've built around this series goes further than the videos. For each of the 8 modules, you get an article-by-article regulatory mapping, an RTS and ITS extract sheet, a control library you can adapt to your specific CASP type, and a fully worked case study with regulatory response analysis. It's designed to be the reference document you bring to your next board meeting or NCA engagement. MiCA's enforcement provisions include personal liability for senior management, not just fines on the firm. Ireland's implementing regulations cap individual penalties at up to €1 million for certain article breaches. ESMA has been explicit. NCAs are expected to enforce against firms continuing to provide services without authorization once the transitional period ends. The individuals responsible for those decisions are personally exposed. Every episode in this series follows the same investigative thread. We start with the regulatory text. We trace it through the supervisory expectation, what ESMA says an NCA should look for. We show you the control that maps to that expectation, and we anchor it in a real scenario, either an emerging MiCA enforcement case, a pre-MiCA crypto AML case reframed under the new regime, or a forward-looking hypothetical built directly from the EBA's risk factor category. There's one more dimension worth flagging for the professionals watching this. The AMLA, the EU's new anti-money laundering authority, has the power of direct supervision over the highest risk CASPs, not just national oversight, direct EU-level supervision. For the stablecoin episode, we look at what triggers that threshold and what AMLA direct supervision means in practice for the firms it covers. MiCA is not a future problem, it is a now problem. The authorization regime has been live since 30 December 2024. The travel rule is in force. The EBA's extended guidelines are active. The firms that got ahead of this are already operating with a competitive advantage in the world's largest regulated crypto market. The firms that didn't are on ESMA's radar. This series exists because the professionals dealing with MiCA's consequences every day deserve more than a 5-minute summary. They deserve primary source-grounded analysis, real case frameworks, and tools they can actually use. If that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. Episode 1 of the MiCA series drops next week. The big picture, why AMLD5 failed, how the 3-law EU framework works, and the first case study. Subscribe now so you don't miss it. And if you know an MLRO, a legal counsel, or a compliance director working in crypto, send this to them. This is the series that gives them the edge they need. I'll see you in episode 1.